order to understand the situation which the Conservative Party now stands in, you really have to understand what it was and what it stood for. What destroyed it? That's a very important subject, but actually I think it boils down to one word: money. So I don't think any decent person would go near the current Conservative Party, and I think it's about to get even worse. It's mutating.
Welcome back to the Dartington Library. I'm joined by Peter Oborne. Peter is a well-known Conservative commentator, former political editor of The Spectator, has written for The Daily Telegraph, and is the author of Johnson and Trump, The Emergence of a New Moral Barbarism. We're going to talk about the future of the Conservative Party. Welcome, Peter. So how would you describe the state of the Conservative Party in the aftermath of the recent election?
The Conservative Party is in a process of ceasing to exist in a conventional way. It's it's been the most successful party in the Western world for the last 200 years. It's basically been the leading party which has governed our country. It's embodied certain values. It's had a way of going about things. That's all gone. This is not 1997 when the Conservatives had a major electoral setback. This is obliteration. It's a bit like the Terminator. It's changing shape, though, and it's changing shape in a very ugly and horrible way.
Describe that process to me then. What's happened and what is it becoming?
This election is almost the final moment of a long period of disintegration and moral horror, I think is a correct phrase to use about the Conservative Party. In order to understand the situation which the Conservative Party now stands in, you really have to understand what it was and what it stood for. Let's go back 70 years, the aftermath of World War II. It had 3 million members. 3 million members of the Conservative Party, which is about 10% of the British population, adult population, voting population at the time. It was funded by, they all made small donations, so it didn't have any big business backers. There were none of these focus group whiz kids and strategists and all that nonsense, because the volunteers did it. They would go door to door with leaflets, and the Conservative Party was embedded in civil society. That is to say, the Conservative Party dances, there were Conservative Party fetes, they were involved very heavily in local charities, and so it was almost organic. It was part. And I think when we're discussing and let's be honest about it, the collapse of the Conservative Party, you have to understand it's also the changing nature of civil society, the kind of the world which created or enabled the Conservative Party has actually gone. What destroyed it? That's a very important subject, but actually I think it boils down to one word: money. The novelist Ernest Hemingway described the process of bankruptcy. It's very gradual and then sudden. And I think that describes what happened to the Conservatives in the last 10 years, 15 years. It lost its base in civil society. The membership went over a cliff after Thatcher and Major. From about 1 million, it still was in the early 90s, to about 150,000 at the start of the century, the current century. So the income collapsed. Wasn't any, really. And also the volunteers collapsed. So in elections, you couldn't knock door to door. But there was still the title, the Conservative Party, and there was still the legal structure. And around 2005, 6, when Cameron became leader, a group of super rich people, billionaires, very rich millionaires, realised that they could buy the Conservative Party. And so very, very quickly, it ceased to be controlled by what was very dismissively and ugly phrase, the Grey Rinse Brigade. People used to mock them, these wonderfully patriotic, compassionate, elderly women who ran the ran the communities they lived in, and cared about the communities they lived in, and were very filled with a sense of public duty, were replaced by quite a small cadre of billionaires who didn't pay British tax, and they realised they could buy access to power and influence by paying, well, in their terms, almost negligible sums of money, maybe 5 million, to the party, which would enable them to get a great deal of access to the politicians and decide their policies.
So that was 2005, 2006.
That's when it started.
Yeah.
And the model for this was created by Tony Blair. In 1994, when Tony Blair ran for the Labour leadership, he made a calculation that he wanted to govern without the trade unions, which is in many ways that the trade unions were the same as the Tory membership, the same function. You know, they provided the funding, they provided the energy, and much of the personnel for the Labour Party, just as the membership had done, mass membership of the Tories had done the same for the Conservatives. But the trade unions were seen by Blair as an enemy, something which had to be diminished and effectively destroyed. And so he through Jonathan Powell, had this fund of private fund, which meant that he was no longer dependent financially on the unions, instead of which there was a group of very rich men whose identities we didn't know, who funded Blair's run for the leadership, and then it run into 1997. It gave him independence of the organic roots which had created Labour. And the second thing which Blair did, which was new and hadn't happened despite the mythology which surrounds the subject under Margaret Thatcher, was he formed an embedded alliance with Rupert Murdoch. So what Blair decided he would govern alongside Murdoch. He invited Murdoch into the inner councils of New Labour and Murdoch's journalists, and gave Murdoch quite a lot of prescriptive power over what policies Labour would run, for instance, on Europe. Now, this is a fantastically successful method because he won over the British press, and he won over British business, and was able to take the British working classes, who had traditionally voted Labour, for granted. And they had nowhere else to go, not at first.
So Cameron sees this process and thinks that's something that he can emulate in the Conservative Party.
Exactly. Cameron did exactly the same thing. I don't need to worry about the traditional membership, but I want to govern with Murdoch, and I want to govern with the billionaire class. He tried to govern without Murdoch from 2005, when he became leader, to 2007, when he collapsed in the polls. He looked like failing and being thrown out. And at that point, he brought in Coulson.
Andy Coulson, yeah.
Andy Coulson.
Former News of the World editor.
Yeah, basically he was a Murdoch thing. And thereafter, he just governed for Murdoch, or with the policies which the Sun reader was said to want. And that proved quite successful. And he went on to get a majority, former coalition government in 2010, and dislodged Labour. But what Cameron had done was emulate Blair in effectively removing civil society from their political parties. The trade unions on the one hand, the Tory members, the shires and all that from the Tories.
So that leaves the Conservative Party then post-Brexit in the hands according to your analysis, of billionaires, but also, crucially, not in the hands of David Cameron, but in the hands of first Theresa May, then Boris Johnson, later Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak.
Cameron sort of set this in motion, but he was a traditional Tory himself. He did have certain genuine Tory characteristics. And so it wasn't obvious to begin with what had happened under Cameron. But he might, and the fatal apotheosis of the Conservative Party might not have happened but for Brexit. But once it had, Cameron left, and the Conservative Party effectively went into play. There's a very symbolic thing which I think happened. The membership counted for nothing from that moment. When Boris Johnson became Tory leader in 2019, he appointed Ben Elliott as Tory chairman. Now, in the traditional period, the Tory chairman would be a man with a large bottom.
A grandee.
A grandee, and it's a term abused now, but it'd be Willie Whitelaw or that sort of, had fought in World War II and might not have been the sharpest tack in the box, but, could spot a wrong un.
Yeah, a time-served Conservative with the respect of the broader party.
Yeah. Now, Ben Elliott, I don't think he'd had any connection with the Tory party that I know of, but in fact, he ran a concierge service for the super rich. He could arrange to fix them to get to meet royal family or attend society event. That's what he did. He had a client list of people who were trying to buy their way into the establishment, and that is who Boris Johnson made Conservative Party chairman. He didn't have links to the Tory membership, except probably at the very elite level of the super rich members, But it was an extraordinary thing to do, and he had no kind of understanding of politics as it really works. And at this stage, the Conservative Party became really an instrument, as far as I can see, for very rich people. And the home of the Conservative Party, we're talking at the elite home, it's a very fascinating thing. The history books will tell you that in the 1960s, the Conservative Party was governed from White's Club, which is the very old established former coffee house in St. James's Street. And Ian MacLeod wrote about this in his famous essay about the Tory leadership election of 1964, which produced the old Etonian aristocrat Alec Douglas-Hume as leader from nowhere. And it was all allegedly plotted at White's. But by the second decade of the 21st century, the key club was a place called 5 Hertford Street, which is in about 500 yards away from White's in St. James's. It's in Mayfair, just off Shepherd's Market, I think. And 5 Hertford Street, it just smells of money. You go into it. It's a home of oligarchs and super rich, and that's where the Tory politics, it's quite well documented. High Tory, big decisions, private meetings, moved to 5 Hertford Street. And that became the spiritual home of the Conservative Party in the last 10 years, just as White's had been the sort of spiritual home in the 1950s and 60s.